Today we're going to be reading the story of Ruby Bridges by Robert Coles, illustrated by George Ford. Ruby Bridges is a civil rights activist and is currently the age of 65. She was the first African American student to attend an all-white school in the South in 1960 when she was just 6 years old. Before reading, we're going to take a picture walk to activate our background knowledge and make some predictions. When looking at pages 5 and 6, where do we think this part of the story is taking place? While looking at pages 7 and 8, what might these people be doing and where might they be at? When looking at pages 9 and 10, what do you think is happening? While looking at pages 13 and 14, what predictions can we make about why she's sitting in an empty classroom? By looking at pages 19 and 20, what do you think all these people are doing, and how do you think the girl might be feeling? While looking at pages 20 and 21, who do you think this lady is, and what do you think her and the little girl are talking about? While looking at the last page, what do you think the young girl might be doing, and how do you think she feels at the end of the story? Now I'm going to read the story aloud. As I read, we are going to stop at the pages we previously made predictions on and see if our predictions were correct. The story of Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. We were very poor, very, very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day. After they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonough, 19, and 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to the 1st grade in the William France Elementary School. On these pages, we made a prediction about where the story was taking place at this part. Were we correct? Ruby's parents were proud that their daughters had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. We sat there and prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that we'd be all strong and we'd have courage and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all of the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard. On this page, we made a prediction about what the characters were doing and where the story was taking place. Do we have to go back and change our prediction? On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the France Elementary School. The people carried signs that they said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby's names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. The marshals carried guns. On these pages, we made a prediction about what we thought the characters were doing. Do we have to go back and change our prediction? Every day, for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the France school surrounded by marshals. Wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail, Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with her and learn with, to eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She did not seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom, an empty building. Before reading, we made a prediction about why we thought the classroom was empty. Now that we know why, do we have to go back and change our prediction? Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry. How she went by those mobs and sat here all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. Then one morning something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. Before reading, we previously made a prediction about what was happening on this page and how Ruby was feeling. Do we have to go back and change this prediction? When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. We previously made a prediction about who we thought the older lady was and what her and the young girl were talking about. Now that we know that the older lady is Mrs. Henry and they were speaking about Ruby talking to the angry mob, do we have to go back and change our prediction? When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." Now that we know what Ruby was doing, do we have to go back and change our prediction that we made before reading the story? Also, how does the story end and how did it make you feel? Now we're going to go back through the story and stop on the pages that we previously stopped on. We're going to discuss our predictions and see if we had to make any changes. On these pages, we know that the story was taking place in a courtroom. Do you think it was a good decision to let her attend an all-white elementary school? After reading the story, we know that the Bridges family was praying. But what is Ruby's mother specifically praying for? After reading, we found out that these people were protesting outside of Frank's elementary school because they did not want Ruby attending. What are your feelings about this? Now that we know that Ruby was all alone in the classroom because parents wouldn't let their children attend a school, how do you think this made her feel? Now that we know that these people are protesting, and after hearing some of the things that they were saying to Ruby, how does this impact the story? We learned that Ruby stopped every morning and every day after school to pray for the angry mob. How do you think Miss Henry feels after hearing this? Now that we know why Ruby was praying, how does it make you feel? How did this entire book make you feel? Express your thoughts. I hoped while reading this story, you learned a lot about Ruby Bridges and the impact she made during the Civil Rights Movement.